Excerpts from On Stalin by notable African-American sociologist, civil rights activist, and co-founder of the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois. Originally published in the National Guardian, March 16, 1953, 11 days after Stalin's death. Joseph Stalin was a great man. Few other men of the 20th century approach his stature. He was simple, calm, and courageous. He seldom lost his poise, pondered his problems slowly, made his decisions clearly and firmly, never yielded to ostentation nor coyly refrained from holding his rightful place with dignity. He was the son of a serf, but stood calmly before the great without hesitation or nerves. But also, and this was the highest proof of his greatness, he knew the common man, felt his problems, followed his fate. Stalin was not a man of conventional learning. He was much more than that. He was a man who thought deeply, read understandingly, and listened to wisdom, no matter whence it came. He was attacked and slandered as few men of power have been, yet he seldom lost his courtesy and balance. Nor did he let attack drive him from his convictions nor induce him to surrender positions which he knew were correct. As one of the despised minorities of man, he first set Russia on the road to conquer race prejudice and make one nation out of its 140 groups without destroying their individuality. 3 great decisions faced Stalin in power, and he met them magnificently. First, the problem of the peasants, then the West European attack, and the last, the Second World War. The poor Russian peasant was the lowest victim of Tsarism, capitalism, and the Orthodox Church. He surrendered the little white father easily. He turned less readily, but perceptibly, from his icons. But his kulaks clung tenaciously to capitalism and were near wrecking the revolution when Stalin risked a second revolution and drove out the rural bloodsuckers. Then came intervention, the continuing threat of attack by all nations, halted by the Depression, only to be reopened by Hitlerism. It was Stalin who steered the Soviet Union between Scylla and Charybdis. Western Europe and the US were willing to betray her to fascism, and then had to beg her aid in the Second World War. A lesser man than Stalin would have demanded vengeance for Munich. He had the wisdom to ask only justice for his fatherland. This Roosevelt granted, but Churchill held back. The British Empire proposed first to save itself in Africa and Southern Europe, while Hitler smashed the Soviets. The second front dawdled, but Stalin pressed unfalteringly ahead. He risked the utter ruin of socialism in order to smash the dictatorship of Hitler and Mussolini. After Stalingrad, the Western world did not know whether to weep or applaud. The cost of victory to the Soviet Union was frightful. To this day, the outside world has no dream of the hurt, the loss, and the sacrifices. For his calm, stern leadership here, if nowhere else, arises the deep worship of Stalin by the people of all the Russias. Then came the problem of peace. Hard as this was to Europe and America, it was far harder to Stalin and the Soviets. The conventional rulers of the world hated and feared them, and would have been only too willing to see the utter failure of this attempt at socialism. At the same time, the fear of Japan and Asia was also real. Diplomacy, therefore, took hold, and Stalin was picked as the victim. He was called in conference with British imperialism, represented by its trained and well-fed aristocracy, and with the vast wealth and potential power of America, represented by its most liberal leader in half a century. Here, Stalin showed his real greatness. He neither cringed nor strutted. He never presumed. He never surrendered. He gained the friendship of Roosevelt and the respect of Churchill. He asked neither adulation nor vengeance. He was reasonable and conciliatory, but on what he deemed essential, he was inflexible. He was willing to resurrect the League of Nations, which had insulted the Soviets. He was willing to fight Japan, even though Japan was then no menace to the Soviet Union and might be death to the British Empire and to American trade. But on 2 points, Stalin was adamant. Clemenceau's cordon sanitaire must be returned to the Soviets, whence it had been stolen as a threat. The Balkans were not to be left helpless before Western exploitation for the benefit of land monopoly. The workers and peasants there must have their say. Such was the man who lies dead, still the butt of noisy jackals and of the ill-bred men of some parts of the distempered West. In life, he suffered under continuous and studied insult. He was forced to make bitter decisions on his own lone responsibility. His reward comes as the common man stands in solemn acclaim.
Welcome to ProlesPod.
So, a little overview on who we are if you're listening to us for the first time, as well as what we're trying to do. Hi, we're ProlesPod, your absolute favorite podcast on history, politics, and culture, without the liberalism, which, by the way, is an updated extension, a phoenix rising from the ashes, if you will, of the OG podcast, Proles of the Round Table, still anchored by two of the legacy proles, Jeremy and Justin. And now with new additions, Ray, that's me, Martin, and Tony. If you're an old Proles head from the original run and you're like, oh my God, what happened and when did you get back? They've already covered this, so head to episode 49 to hear it. We are hoping that this series can reach a wider audience than our usual listenership, to whom we owe an enormous debt and to whom we are endlessly grateful. So with that in mind, I'm going to explain a little bit more than I normally would about our politics. If you're newly left or left curious, it is sufficient for us to say that we are all communists. If you're already red-pilled and deeply invested enough to have chosen a tendency for yourself, then I can elaborate and say we are all specifically Marxist-Leninists. This basically means that we have a lot in common with most any other anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist tendency. Our vision for a more just future that honors the dignity and potential of all peoples and all living things is that of a stateless society, no longer burdened by the violence of class, classism, and all the other interconnected hierarchies of oppression. Furthermore, by applying a Marxist analysis to history and learning from examples of revolutions throughout the world, most especially the one in this series, the USSR, we believe that the way to do that is through what we would call a two-stage revolution. The first stage would be to seize power from the existing ruling class as a transitionary period. The second stage would be the end goal I mentioned before, that of a stateless, classless society. So basically, we're of the understanding that you can't just divest from the state apparatus, and if everyone does it all together, we will arrive at communism. That the transitionary period, incited by a revolutionary struggle, is a necessary step on the path. If you want a deeper dive into some of these ideas, check out episode 61 on a text called The Foundations of Leninism. Regarding this current project, the Stalin Eras series, our aim is to examine the life of this incredibly controversial figure, Joseph Stalin, not just as an individual, but in the context of the USSR and the world at this time. And obviously, just from the premise of this series, it is clear that Stalin is someone for whom we have a lot of respect and admiration. However, this series is not intended to be a hagiography. That said, because of a decades-long campaign to slander every single decision this man did or did not make, you as the listener might get the impression that we're not interested in exploring or acknowledging any of his shortcomings or anything he could have done differently. Fear not, haters! The last episode in this series is reserved wholly to discuss the most common criticisms of Stalin, which, by the way, if you're a Patreon subscriber, we would love for you to tell us which criticisms you'd specifically like us to discuss. But before we get to the crit episode, we have several eras to cover. Today, we are looking at Stalin's early life, and it is a shorter episode than normal. But for some of the episodes, we will bring on guests, some of whom I'm sure many of you all know and love, to help guide our discussion and share their insights as well. Every era, apart from today's, will be divided into 2 parts. The first part, which will be released as a standalone episode, will be a clear narrative of the time period we're covering. If you struggle to orient yourself through space and time, or you're fuzzy on when things happen and where, this section is for you. The second section of each era, which will also be released as a separate standalone episode, will be a more open discussion, zooming in on the most important aspects of the period so that you can learn more than just names and dates, and so that you have the time and space to challenge your preconceptions. All in all, the 6-part Stalin Eras series will span 12 episodes, released weekly, as opposed to our usual bi-weekly release schedule. Because this series demands a high level of listenership on your part, we will do our best to keep things interesting for you. And of course, for our paid subscribers, every discussion episode will have a corresponding bonus episode and conversation with our guest hosts. We offer this series in the hopes that our close comrades will feel that this is a sufficient overview to share with others who are curious but, like so many, mis- or underinformed on the subject. It is our intention to make this series feel accessible and to really make this period come alive in a way that we hope will be a new and engaging experience. As you can imagine, this project has been an enormous undertaking in terms of research, resources, and time. It's the first of its kind for us, but we hope it won't be the last. If examining history, politics, and culture in this way feels meaningful for you, we invite you to become subscribers at our Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/ProlesPod. If a monetary commitment isn't a possibility for you, we totally understand. Even the free tier has additional resources. You can also share our episode with your friends, rate and review the show on any podcast catcher you know. Follow us while a bunch of old people try to figure out social media. And of course, we love to see your feedback and your questions either at Patreon or through email at ProlesPod@outlook.com.
This is Jeremy, one of the legacy proles, as Ray said. Way back in the autumn of 2018, when ProlesPod had barely a few hundred listeners, Brett O'Shea asked Justin and I to join him on his much more popular podcast, Revolutionary Left Radio. Brett wanted us to speak to the complicated life and legacy of Joseph Stalin from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. Although we had immersed ourselves in the immortal science, we were essentially baby MLs. So while we think that episode is a valuable resource, particularly on the myths surrounding the so-called Holodomor, and while we do not regret being a part of it, we do think we could have done much better. Flash forward to the summer of 2023, when Justin and I were first beginning to talk through the possibility of relaunching Proles. One of the first things I wanted to do was take a second crack at this admittedly challenging subject. My plan was to do a single episode on or around the 5th anniversary of our talk with Brett. This, of course, did not come to fruition, as the preparations discussed on our reintroduction episode lasted well into the winter, and we didn't even onboard Tony until early 2024. Regardless, Justin pointed out the obvious issues with attempting a single episode, and so we chose to expand the concept into a series. Because, of course we did. There is no concise way to address everything. Even in this grand format, there are so many topics, so many periods, so many details we had to leave out. Plus, we now have 3 additional folks who can provide their own fresh analysis. But aside from Justin and I wanting a do-over, what are we trying to accomplish here? Why are we doing this? Well, on the one hand, many people, particularly in the West, perceive Stalin as some great monster who held hundreds of millions of innocent lives in his crushing grasp. And on the other, we have individuals who perceive a great man of history who, shepherd-like, single-handedly guided hundreds of millions of Soviet citizens into the promised land. And neither of these images bear any resemblance to reality. The former is a cartoonish, outlandish picture painted by anti-communist propaganda. The latter, while flattering, is not based on a materialist analysis of history. nor a true accounting of Stalin, because Stalin, like you or I, was human, deeply human. He was dependable, he was funny, he wrote poetry, he robbed banks, he made good decisions, he made bad ones, he was loved, he was hated, he was flawed, and he was one person of many people who shaped the worlds of 1917, of 1933, of 1941, of today. We will discuss Stalin as a leader, as a follower, as a friend. We will try our best to contextualize him within each circumstance and era in which he existed. We will talk victories and controversies and successes and failures. But above all, we will try to bring this villain and this hero down to earth. We will try our best to humanize him.
This is Tony. I've had the privilege to speak with more than a handful of scholars, historians, anthropologists, and sociologists from the world over the past 2 years on my other podcast, Actually Existing Socialism. And one point all of them have made crystal clear to me is that the popular depiction of the Soviet Union you may have learned in school, seen in movies, or other popular media is wrong. This gap between academic and popular understanding is not unique to the study of Soviet history. For many fields of study, whether in the humanities or sciences, this is the case. But what makes this gap unique is that it originated in the global, ideological, and material conflict known as the Cold War. This conflict had a deliberate distortion effect on all knowledge production and reproduction then as it does today. And to be fair, this distortion went both ways. However, it is important to note that in the 1980s, when a joint Soviet-American government commission reviewed history textbooks, both parties agreed that Soviet textbooks were generally more reliable. But I digress. The reality is, if you grew up in America, the most comprehensive, yet highly flawed, insight into the Soviet Union was most likely shaped by these two fictional, non-historical works, Animal Farm and 1984 by George Orwell, which were both heavily promoted by the CIA into American public consciousness. I remember myself watching the animated film version of Animal Farm in the 7th grade. It turns out that this animated film version was in fact partly funded by and received script edits directly from the CIA. Orwell's easily digestible and anti-communist books were representative of the dominant historical school of thought regarding the Soviet Union in Western academia well up until the 1970s. This approach to Soviet history was known as the totalitarian view. Unfortunately, this largely discredited perspective is the most common public perception of the Soviet Union today. Following World War II, very quickly a distinction was artificially drawn between the capitalist Allied powers on one hand and their former ally, the Socialist Soviet Union, on the other hand, with Westerners grouping the Soviets with fascists of both German and Italian types, contrasting the Eastern Bloc with the pro-apartheid, segregationist, colonial home countries, democratic and freedom-loving societies of the West. The view of this school was that the single-party Soviet state was all-powerful, all-encompassing, and had total control of society. This total society, founded by Lenin and ratcheted up in evilness by Stalin, maintained power through repression, terror, and propaganda at a level unheard of. And thus, the Soviet Union was an inherent threat to the so-called free world, and to think of it other than a freedom-strangling regime was anathema. Perhaps the most famous of these totalitarian scholars is the late Robert Conquest, who was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by George W. Bush for his historical efforts in 2005. Conquest published works such as The Great Terror, Stalin's Purges of the 1930s, and The Harvest of Sorrow, Soviet Collectivization, and the Terror Famine. You may have heard his name before. What is lesser known about Conquest is that from 1948 to 1956, he worked for the British government's secretive Information Research Department, or IRD, an organization whose goal was to shape public opinion against the Soviet Union, and which used in its arsenal of techniques disinformation, fake news, and so-called black propaganda using front publishing houses to distribute these materials. The RD was also notorious for drumming up sentiment against anti-colonial and anti-apartheid movements in Asia and Africa. After his stint there, Conquest, innocently of course, became a freelance historical writer, receiving the bulk of his information from the IRD throughout the 60s, which was still a secret organization at the time. It wasn't until 1977 that the IRD and their disinformation operation was exposed and allegedly ended. This belated revelation, of course, greatly compromised the legitimacy of his and others' works, but did little to diminish the support he received from right-wing think tanks and the anti-communist political elites. What Conquest serves as an example of is the incestuous relationship between the production of Soviet history in the West and its explicitly anti-communist intelligence agencies during the Cold War. This doubt on Conquest's career is not what led to the development of a new view of Soviet history, but it certainly buttressed its ascension. And this school is somewhat confusingly called the revisionist school. It emerged from young scholars in the 1970s and the 1980s who wanted to challenge the dominant totalitarian view. As veteran Soviet historian Christopher Reed wrote in a 2020 publication regarding the use of the term revisionist school perhaps not being the best, stated the following: that the revisionist school is not the process of overturning a deeply researched conventional view, which is what revisionism usually is, but rather the preliminary establishment of an evidence-based view detailing the contours of Russia's experience of so-called Stalinism and the emergence of a better grounded interpretation of Stalin. The revisionists argued that the Soviet state was not totalitarian, monolithic, or inherently and always a repressive system. It was rather a complex, changing system that frankly didn't have the ability or will to have total control. Stalin was also not an all-powerful monster who could alter the system with a whim. These scholars looked at history from the bottom up and looked at the variety of ways that Soviet citizens had agency. This was certainly a more holistic approach to Soviet society. These scholars include people like J.R. Szkedy, Robert Thurston, William Chase, Lynn Viola, and Sheila Fitzpatrick, to name a few. What really ended the dominance of the totalitarian view was the opening up of Soviet archives in the early 1990s, which led to the overturning of many of its key dogmas. Since then, the approach to Soviet history have continued to evolve in multifaceted ways, but in ways far removed from the initial, yet widely pervasive, totalitarian view. In brief, here are some important conclusions generally agreed to in modern Soviet scholarship that will be addressed in our series. 1. The 1956 secret speech by Khrushchev, which famously soured the view of Stalin around the world, is considered unreliable in many parts. And 2. Trotsky, who for so long was the major source about Stalin and the Soviet Union in the West, has also been deemed now a problematic source over many of his claims. 3. Many of the so-called death toll figures and numbers related to state repression, such as the Gulag system or the Great Purge, were heavily inflated and based on poor or non-existent data. And number 4, Soviet leaders, including Stalin, actually believed in the things that they said and were committed Marxist-Leninists. 5. The Soviet system did have popular support and popular participation in its model, though often in ways that differed greatly from Western liberal democracies. And finally, the Soviet state simply did not have total control of society. These largely liberal scholars who I mentioned earlier who support these views are far from fans or stans of the Soviet Union. Rather, based on extensive archival research on their part, they have had to concede that many popular ideas of the Soviet Union are flat out false. While these liberal scholars will make up the bulk of our sources for this project, we still will have differing interpretations of certain events or evidence as Marxist-Leninists. In summary, the Stalin Eras is our attempt to A. help put forth current scholarship about the Soviet Union into popular consciousness, and B. put forth our own perspective as communists about the history of the Soviet Union.
Justin here. This series is going to be a journey, one that delves into the complexities, accomplishments, and controversies surrounding perhaps the most influential figure of the 20th century. Now, before we embark on this together, we want to be upfront about a few things. As mentioned, yes, we are communists, and that undeniably shapes our perspective. However, we are also committed to presenting a nuanced and critical narrative from a dialectical materialist and historical perspective. We encourage you to engage with the material we present, but also to do your own research. Soviet history, communist history in general, it's rich and complex, and there's always more to learn. We fully anticipate that this series will spark debate and criticism. That's healthy, and it's something we welcome. In fact, we're so committed to addressing the criticisms and questions surrounding Stalin that we'll be dedicating an entire episode at the end of the series specifically to this purpose. We want to hear from you. If you have burning questions, critiques, or counterarguments you'd like us to address, send them our way. Emailing ProlesPod@outlook.com or DMing on Patreon is the best way to get that to us. Paid Patreon subscribers will get priority on their submissions, so if you want to make sure your voice is heard, consider supporting the show. Throughout this series, we'll strive to present multiple sides of the issues, pulling from a range of sources and perspectives. We'll acknowledge the controversies, the difficult truths, and the complexities surrounding Stalin's actions and legacy. As Ray mentioned at the opening, we're not here to paint a hagiography, but rather to provide a deeper understanding of the man, the context of his time, and the impact of his decisions. We're excited to embark on this journey with you. We hope you'll find it informative, thought-provoking, and we are almost certain that regardless of your knowledge level, socialist tendency, or political persuasion, you will learn something new. And most of all, we hope you enjoy this series as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. So with that said, let's dive into it.
At the turn of the 19th century, Russia was a vast multicultural empire, playing catch-up with the rest of Europe. We're talking about one of the longest holdouts of feudalism in the world. Even famously feudal Japan was quicker to eschew that system than Russia. One of the cultures within the grasp of this empire was Georgia. Nestled between the Caucasus and the Black Sea, it has existed in some loose form since antiquity as part of the Roman Empire. It became a state proper as a kingdom somewhere in the 6th century AD. Through ups and downs, golden ages, conflict, and more, it remained an independent state, until the year 1801, when it was annexed by Russia. This is important to know. Georgia was a rough place, with a strictly observed culture of honor and religious fervor. It is within this context, Joseph Vissarionis Jejugashvili was born in the small town of Gori on December 18th, 1878.
Welcome to the introductory narrative of the Stalin Eras, where Martin will be covering the years 1878 to 1917, from Stalin's birth to the October Revolution. The title we've chosen for this narrative highlights a revolutionary transition, the transition from Soso to Stalin.
Born to Bessarion, or Beso for short, cobbler turned laborer who struggled with alcoholism. The displacements of his craft thanks to industrialization finally reaching Georgia. And his mother, Keteban, or Keke for short, was deeply religious, placing great hope in her son becoming a priest and a scholar. Soso. The common Georgian nickname for Joseph's would be his first name. There's little evidence that his childhood was horribly abusive. Most is hearsay from liberal and conservative historians trying to have an easy win, making their askew idea of Stalin the result of pop psychology and conjured trauma. Stalin himself said that he remembers his childhood fondly, besides of course his early brush with death from smallpox around the age of 6, and a carriage accident, both which left him scarred for life. Keke was by second-hand accounts as much as disciplinarian as any working-class mother would be today. Beso, as mentioned earlier, was a craftsman, up until he couldn't compete with machine-made goods. He ultimately decided to move alone to the capital, Tbilisi nowadays, for bigger pay and a steady income as a factory worker. Going from artisan to worker, having a very independent and self-motivated wife in Keke, an anomaly in Georgian society, as well as the Georgian honor-based culture, may have all compounded in the shame of proletarization resulting in his heavy drinking. That is, of course, my own conjecture. What is not speculation is sadly his alcoholism. Whether Beso beat Soso is subject to debate as well. But the truth is that after Beso moved to Tiflis, he was largely absent from Soso's life, leaving Soso in the hands of Keke. Whether she was determined to see her son rise above their circumstances, or simply wanted her son to become a man of the cloth, is unknown. Whatever her motivations, in 1888, Soso was enrolled into Gori's church school, in which he excelled at. It is also where he got his first taste of empire, the national question, and other ideologies, as the school was rampant with Russophilia, and hell-bent on erasing Georgian culture down to making the pupils pray in Russian. This is also the place that taught him how to read unauthorized literature in secret, such as the works of Darwin. Upon graduating, Keke and Soso would go to the Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1893 and state their case for a full scholarship on the basis of merit and need. Soso was awarded a half scholarship. It was from Keke's labor and the generosity of friends and family that the steep costs, even when cut by half, would be covered. The seminary was the height of local education in Georgia. The offspring of the Georgia bourgeoisie was of course educated abroad in Europe or Moscow, so the need for a local university was non-existent for them. While at seminary, Soso was exposed to the works of Zola, Gogol, Tolstoy, and of course Marx, who would really mark a before and after in his life. After Marx, his grades started declining. Although they bounced back in his last year, he was more brazen in standing up to authority when confronted by his rule-breaking, such as the secret reading groups and his defense of Georgian. The seminary briefly closed the classes on Georgian studies, and through the organized protests of the Georgian pupils, they were reinstated. Contrary to his own account, he wasn't expelled, but a prolonged absence in his last year barred him from finishing seminary. His absence, funnily enough, was educational in nature, as he was reading voraciously and also teaching theory in his flat, and near the railways too, while holding his first job as a meteorologist for the Tiflis Observatory. It is during this time that he also gets acquainted with the writings of Lenin. This relative tranquility would not last, as he joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, RSLDP for short, in 1899, and his talent as an educator and agitator was put to good use. Much to the chagrin of the top brass, Soso barely evaded arrest in May Day 1900, on a demonstration he helped organize. The committee, not liking insubordination, sent him far from the capital, to Batumi, to help with a local struggle between workers at a Rothschild oil refinery. He helped organize an almost successful strike, which saw the refinery agree to wage increases only to purge the so-called, quote-unquote, troublemakers from the workforce, in tandem with arrests of labor leaders. This led to a repressed demonstration at the prison which resulted in casualties, the Batumi Massacre of 1902, and culminated in another demonstration during the Barrels of the Dead. It was here that Soso was arrested for the first time. His process through the system was a slog. They had no evidence against him, but a fateful mistake would cost him exile. 2 notes of his were intercepted, one asking allies to inform his mother of his arrest, the other addressed to a contact in Tiflis, asking the party for a replacement in Batumi now that he was behind bars. This put him squarely as a conspirator with the Tiflis labor movement, and he was sentenced to exile in Western Siberia. Exile has meant many things, but at this juncture in Russian history, it did not mean a work camp, as most would believe, but literal exile, a barely guarded, barely supplied prison camp for disruptors to the system not to be punished, just to be far away from the center of a very centralized state. This is why we have all these tales of Lenin and other leaders thriving and being prolific writers in the middle of nowhere. But to a young agitator and career revolutionary as Soso, this was torture. So he quickly escaped. Upon returning to Tiflis in 1904, he would be acquainted with the Bolshevik-Menshevik schism. Led by Lenin, Bolsheviks, derived from the Russian word for majority, thought the RSLDP should be a disciplined centralized apparatus with career revolutionaries such as Soso, facilitating the working class into revolution. Mensheviks, derived from the Russian word for minority, on the other hand, argued that a more incrementalist revolution, a more democratic and inclusive party that would eventually lead to revolution, was the way to go. Not being one for incrementalism, Soso would quickly identify himself as a Bolshevik. In a widely Menshevik Georgia, he even started correspondence with Lenin during this time. About that name, Soso, being a man in the crosshairs of authority for 4+ years meant that he had to come up with an alias and give up his birth name. He identified himself from then on as Koba, inspired by the main character in the novel The Patricide by Georgian author Alexander Kazbegi. Koba, the character, is an avenger for his friends and community from the evil days of Grigola, a Russian-appointed village leader. Koba represents honor, friendship, and respect, but also cunning, strength, and most of all, someone who confronts an unfair system and its minions head-on. Before we move on to his revolutionary activities after exile, we have to at least briefly talk about his first marriage in 1906, first child a year later, and the death of the former shortly after the following year. The career of a revolutionary could be lonely and poignant. A life of sacrifice for workers you'll never meet. This speed run through a narrow slice of regular life and its hardship strengthened his resolve for revolution. Also of note, his first meeting with Lenin in person, as part of a delegation in Finland, for the 4th Congress of the RSLDP in 1905. Koba survived a literal sinking ship to meet Lenin. Koba would assist in work at organizing, but after Bloody Sunday, the massacre of unarmed protesters in St. Petersburg in 1905, the country was galvanized to action. What that action was to be, Bolsheviks like Koba believed, would have to be led by professional revolutionaries. And action was taken. Koba founded the Outfit. Contrary to mainstream sources, it was neither a gang or a paramilitary group, but a loose collective of revolutionaries that organized various underground activities like strikes, agitprop, and more famously, expropriations. The most famous of these, the Tiflis bank heist of 1907. Also known as the Yerevan Square expropriation, it was a daring revolutionary expropriation and played a crucial role in financing the Bolshevik Party's activities. Seeing the need for funding and not being one to stay idle, Koba used all his skill toward acquiring funds. Nothing was off the table, not even expropriation. A highly controversial tool for some within the party, mainly Mensheviks, this did not deter the pragmatic Koba. The plan? Target a large cash transfer from the state bank, transported by horse-drawn carriages across Yerevan Square in the center of Tiflis. June 26, 1907, day of. Koba's plan was executed. As the carriages entered Yerevan Square, revolutionaries launched a coordinated assault using grenades, bombs, and firearms. The square erupted in chaos. The outfit managed to expropriate the funds. Sadly, bystanders were caught in the crossfire and panic spread throughout the city. Score 341,000 rubles, or $3.4 million in today's money. The funds were well received, but due to new security measures, they were hard to use. The heist's effects were twofold. It established Koba as a daring revolutionary with nerves of steel. This, of course, aiding him in his upward trajectory within the party. But also, the collateral damage of the heist was controversial among party members and workers who saw the expropriation as reckless. After this, Koba's life would remain that of a career revolutionary, with little time to grieve a lost spouse or develop roots. Until 1909, he would be instrumental in organizing strikes across the Caucasus, keeping party discipline, and most of all, avoiding arrest and getting arrested. He would spend some years in exile and would escape. One of the most famous apocryphal tales of escape is when he did so dressed as a woman. True or not, Koba was cultivating a name for himself within the party, and more specifically, the Bolsheviks. He was as resolute a comrade as they come, which would lead to his appointment, or anointment, to the Bolshevik Central Committee by Lenin in 1911. Now in St. Petersburg, he is tasked with bolstering the Bolshevik press, turning the weekly Zvezda, Star in Russian, to the daily Pravda, Truth in Russian, helping to shape the party's message. His stint as editor-in-chief saw him focusing on class struggle, party discipline, criticizing the Mensheviks' politics, and also dabbling into the nationalities question. His byline in all of his works was not Koba, but finally Stalin, the original man of steel, going by its Russian meaning. Stalin's work with the press was crucial in establishing his credibility within the Bolshevik movement. His ability to articulate the party's position clearly and forcefully made him an important voice within the movement, even before he became a major figure in the party leadership. His foray into publishing would be interrupted by one final heist in Tiflis with the outfit in 1912. This expropriation suffered from poor planning and a more ready police force. Funds weren't seized and arrests were many. Stalin would go back to his work in Pravda until he was arrested during a masquerade ball organized to raise funds for the Bolsheviks. His final exile would be particularly brutal, as his many successful escapes would lead him to be placed in Kureika, a small hamlet near the Arctic Circle. Russia would join the First World War during his exile, and reaching a point of desperation in the conflict, they would recruit exiles such as him. Ironically, because of his uneven arms, the result of the aforementioned carriage accident, the battle-hardened revolutionary was not conscripted and spared combat. In 1917, uprisings resulted in the Tsar's abdication. During this commotion, Stalin would return to St. Petersburg and lay the groundwork for Lenin, who was still in self-imposed exile. Although his position in the beginning was collaborative in regards to the bourgeois-backed provisional government, this soon changed with the arrival of Lenin and his April theses, which called for a complete break from the compromise vision of the provisional government and a full revolution with the power centered in the workers. Stalin's work would be instrumental during these months, helping Lenin avoid capture during crackdowns, keeping Pravda and the flow of information and agitation going, and most of all, keeping the party organized and disciplined. This all culminated on October 25th, 1917, the October Revolution. One day before, the provisional government would raid and destroy the Bolshevik press offices. In the early hours of the revolution, he would join the Central Committee, who were coordinating the Bolshevik militias. They would capture Petrograd's electric power station, main post office, State Bank, as well as open fire on the Winter Palace with the Aurora, a Bolshevik-controlled warship. The delegates of the provisional government were arrested, and the revolution was on its way.
Don't leave just yet, comrades. What you're about to hear is a sneak peek of the Stalin Eras Backstage Pass, where we talk more about this episode and so much more. To hear the full conversation, as well as hours of bonus content, head to patreon.com/ProlesPod, where monthly contributions start at just $5 a month.
Particularly about that heist, it's such an impactful history to the point that Disney has even appropriated, or maybe expropriated that story in a sense. For people who may not know, in the popular Star Wars television show that's on Disney Plus, Andor, one of the early plot points was specifically based on that heist that Stalin led, and the main character in that show, I can't remember his name now.
Cassian Andor.
Yeah, Cassian Andor is literally kind of like a stand-in. He is playing the role of Stalin in
the show,
in the heist, and he even in the show, and he even in the show. You're right, and there's a lot of revolutionary themes in that show, and he even kind of looks like a younger Stalin. I'll say that as well too. So
Diego Luna has that.
This is how, this is how kind of I guess maybe powerful I'll say Stalin's life is, that it even bleeds into media forms that are totally contrary to his life and his work.
Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. Oh,